so much, Emily, and I am just delighted to introduce our speaker for tonight. We are very privileged to have as our guest Dr. Mónica Ramírez-Andreotta. She has allowed me to just say Mónica Ramírez, so I will be using that name for the rest of the talk. And she is an associate professor of environmental science with joint appointments in the College of Public Health and Global Change at the University of Arizona. Dr. Ramírez is the director of two co-created community science programs called Gardenroots and Project Harvest, which I'm really excited to hear more about, partnering with EJ environmental justice communities to answer their research questions. She is also the director of the University of Arizona's National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences Superfund Research Programs Research Translation Core, serving as a boundary-spanning individual and facilitating communication of research findings to all stakeholders. With a Ph.D. in soil, water, and environmental science, and a minor in art, she is a transdisciplinary researcher in the purest sense. She received a B.A. degree in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, a B.A. in Studio Art with a minor in Spanish, and a Master's of Public Administration from Columbia University. She was a recipient of the 2019 American Association for the Advancement of Science Early Career Awards for Public Engagement with Science and the 2018 Science and Engineering Excellence Award for Campus Community Outreach for STEM Diversity. She has won numerous other awards, including awards from the NIEHS, and she is also serving as an associate editor for the journal Environmental Justice and the Journal of Exposure Science and Environmental Epidemiology. So Dr. Ramírez, we are just thrilled to have you with us tonight. And with that, I will let you take it away. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you also very much for the invitation to present to your group. I'm eager to learn more about your initiatives and your efforts. So feel free to interrupt me anytime. I'm going to keep this on a, try to keep it under wraps. I always get excited. You just never know what's going to happen. So here we go. All right. So this talk is Partnering for Action, Cultivating Science and Environmental Justice. A land acknowledgement as well. So Arizona, where I'm from, is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, and Tucson is home to the Tono O'odham and Yaqui. University of Arizona is also a Hispanic serving institution, and we are very proud about our level of diversity and inclusion on campus. So just to begin with a positionality statement. So this is an image of my grandmothers in the upper right here. This is Margarita Ramirez, and these are my aunts. And I'm highlighting the map of the US-Mexico border region to acknowledge that I was born and raised in the city in Tucson, Arizona, which is home again to the Tono O'odham and Yaqui tribal communities and lies within 100 kilometers of the US-Mexico borderline, and symbolic boundary reminding us of the 1983 La Paz Agreement to protect, conserve, and improve the environment in the border region. I'm second generation Mexican-American Chicana, went to the oldest high school in Arizona, and I'm dedicated to environmental protection. I've been working with environmental justice since 2006. So a little bit more about where I come from. So I'm the daughter of an engineer who spent time as a miner in building public health infrastructures in the US-Mexico border region, and whose Nana, right, as Margarita, as you see here, held my dad in during labor until they crossed into the US so the next generations could have more opportunity. With a grandfather on my tata who refused to speak English as a form of political protest, bearing witness to social and environmental resiliency and degradation completely changed the way I experienced health. Health no longer became synonymous with biomedical services. It was about the interconnectedness among ecosystem services and human health and well-being. And so now I'm an environmental justice inspired by the possibility that through partnerships with environmental justice community, I may be able to leverage my position to elicit structural change. And I serve as a cultural knowledge broker and participatory research, build trust across cultures, and translate data into forms that are adaptable and useful for community members, as well as other stakeholders to shift the balance of power. And so engaging in where I come from and the biases, right, that I might be introducing into my work is always important in these presentations. You already heard my bio and intro, so just also to overlay the transdisciplinary nature in which I operate from. And so the goal of the lab, and so students who seek me out and come join the lab are dedicated, we are all dedicated to environmental health and climate justice for all. And we are dedicated to this because this is no new news to this group, right? Pollution is the leading cause of premature death and disease. We can see that this paper that came out in the Lancet highlighting that pollution disproportionately kills the poor and vulnerable, but just that it is the #1 killer and of premature death and disease in our society. If we look at a map of federally designated Superfund sites, we can see here that your zip code can be more important than your genetic code. So according to the US General Accounting Office, 1 in 4 Americans live within 3 miles of a hazardous waste site. And this is unfair and unjust. So we live in a time where we're continue to experience forms of environmental racism, and we strive for justice. When striving for justice, we experience fundamental and critical challenges. To summarize those, right, but this is thousands of people talking about and writing about, I should say hundreds with thousands of papers. The idea is that there's limits of epidemiology and the public health context, and there's forms of technical elitism that might override or outspeak, or what we call voices of the unheard or voices of the side effects, whose experiences might not be acknowledged. We also know that conventional methods to address environmental justice fail because they're addressing health at the individual level and not health at the political, the relevant social, cultural, and political context. And so if you're looking solely at the individual behavior rather than these interacting social, cultural, and political contexts, you're gonna miss the bus. So we are striving for justice because we know that when we achieve it, we would reduce environmental health disparities. We know that disparities are these differences in health outcomes that are linked with social and economic and environmental disadvantage. And as previously stated, we know that these are unnecessary, avoidable, and unjust. And so the laboratory and what we do is we strive for structural change. We strive to create changes at the meso level. We hope to see changes at the policy and enforcement levels to essentially hit the structure and the system versus just incremental. And so one thing that that's been really exciting over the past, I would say decades, is how many different groups have been talking about participatory research methods. And so what I have highlighted here is actually 16 different terms spanning different disciplines. So some of these might be public health, some of these could be GIS, geography, anthropology, sociology, ecological studies. But the idea here is that you have disciplines from multiple disciplines coming to the same conclusion, that we should be engaging, right, those who are closest to the challenge because they have an understanding that we do not. Those closest to the challenge are closer to the solution, and that this collaborative co-created space is very exciting. And so taken from one of the graphics that we designed for Project Harvest, regardless of our distance, we're all in this together. And this was designed specifically around and to give out some love during the pandemic. But we should think about that we're all in this together when we're striving for the types of changes we want to see related to environmental health. And so there has been some debate in the field on terminology. I'm not going to spend time on that. I'm just going to say that sea science, right, is something that's appreciated by a working group through the Citizen Science Association. But I'm acknowledging here that what I'll be using today is co-created community science. And we know that these efforts are transforming investigations. They're transforming who's generating data and how that data is shared. And we know that to be transformative with these processes, you need to begin with listening and humility, which can lead to partnership building. And so what we situate ourselves and say is that we could, that academic institutions can leverage their positions of power in working in collaboration with environmental justice communities in ways that work upstream to structurally adjust the systems that perpetuate the injustice. And I'll be giving examples from Gardenroots and Project Harvest in the lab for the talk today. This is a map showing, or excuse me, this is a set of like generic steps of community, what the scientific research process might include. And so when we're thinking about doing community science, we want to think about the level of engagement at all or most of these steps. And so for today, I'll go through these briefly. And so if you imagine living near, so I'm in the arid, semi-arid environment of Arizona. I'm working with communities living near resource extraction, or more specifically mining, hard rock mining, copper mining. And so these are some of the images of where people live and what they might be observing, hearing, seeing, and smelling. And so with this said, community members, right, meeting people where they are, which I'll talk a little bit about, are asking questions about their soil quality, if they can consume locally grown foods, if incidental ingestion of any soils would pose an unhealthy exposure route, what is the quality of the air in the area, settled dust, and are there pollutants in harvested rainwater? So those communities that are living in those in the near resource extraction are asking these types of questions. And if you look at this, so I showed you what it might look like living there, but if you look at the EPA's toxic release inventory data set, this is a map of Arizona. We have about 264 toxic release inventory sites. And you see the bigger the purple dot, the larger the release. And so you can see these large dots here and in here. And so if we look at those are the areas in which I have the honor of working. I work with the community members living in these spaces. So I've been working with environmental justice communities living near sources of industrial pollution since 2006, as well as state and federal Superfund sites. Dewey Humboldt is a community sandwiched in between two sources of waste. This is a federally designated Superfund site. Globe Miami is active mining, Hayden is active mining and an alternative Superfund site, and Superior, which you see here, is a legacy mining community. However, there's a large proposed mine nearby. And so when you take, the next step is you're defining the research question together, and now you'll gather information and develop explanations. This is a quote from a participant of a project. Right below the mine was our school. That was when the smelter didn't have any controls. There would be sulfur smoke coming out of the top of the stack. When it rained, you'd get acid rain. We'd be choking because the fumes were so bad, but it was just part of life. We lived there and accepted it. This is an example of where that school was located and mine. Here's an example of, these are images from this community where participants talking about the different types of health outcomes she observes in the area and that she thinks that they could be from the mining activity. If you're on the playground in this community, you see the smelter stack is always kind of looming over you in that space. And so how do these partnerships and forms of engagement begin? So in one community, it all stemmed with a superintendent who was open to science investigations and around environmental quality and was very much interested in also providing science education opportunities to students. And so this began with working with the superintendent, the school district, and teachers of providing science education and then building a harvesting rainwater system and helping teachers lead modules and activities around rainwater harvesting and gardening. Here's another community. This is the Globe Miami area where community champions that had welcomed me in were like, to work here, you need to get a blessing from the mine. And so this is where I actually had to go meet with the mine and present the type of research that would be conducted and get their approval in front of the community champions before the work could actually begin. Most of the community gatherings are held in this bullion now called the Cultural Plaza and Museum. But this was the school for Mexican children up until the segregated school for Mexican children up until 1952. And so as a Mexican scientist into this space, but bringing in students of color into these spaces really requires you to talk about the historical context of these spaces. Here's another example, and I give a shout out to Roy C. Chavez, who was the community champion who welcomed me to this environment, who had a legacy of experience as a former teacher, as a former mayor. This individual was concerned about the ongoing mining activity in the area. This is Superior, Arizona, where you actually see the human body being transformed into a drill. So seeing how mining is embedded and tied to this area and history. But big shout out to Roy Chavez for just teaching me. When thinking about working in the Southern Metropolitan Tucson area, this is where I collaborated with a nonprofit or a community-based organization called the Sonoran Environmental Research Institute. And together we trained promotoras, or community health workers. This was a training all done in Spanish on climate change, adaptation, and resiliency. The promotoras were trained in these activities, and then they would go and do door-to-door home visits and train families. They also prepared samples in the laboratory. And one thing that was great, that we saw a statistically significant difference in people's self-efficacy for learning and doing science and taking action to protect the environment. So the promotoras themselves, we saw that change, as well as the participants of the home visits. So we saw that this change was something from the promotora and also observed at the household level. This is my mom, who is in the training. And it's very sweet that she was a promotora and still is a promotora. And so I bring up these idiosyncrasies of each space and who you work with and who you get to know and have the honor of working alongside, because it's this meeting people where they are and seeing multiple forms of knowledge allows, right, and having community, but having those living in those spaces talk about what the research should be and co-lead those research initiatives. And so in these spaces that I've talked about, I would like to, highlighting intersectionality, originally proposed by Kimberly Crenshaw, is acknowledging in these spaces, these are where we have over 50% of the participants do not have a college degree, have identified as a person of color, are limited income. 25%, their dominant language is Spanish, and over 50% live in rural environments. And so one thing's very specific, right? There's a whole paper that we wrote about this, but just to acknowledge when we think about community science or citizen science efforts, one of the things we know about citizen science is that we tend to, those projects, right, contributory style citizen science programs tend to engage those that are highly educated, white, and higher income. And so the question has been like, how do you increase the diversity and inclusion of projects? And so what we observed is that non-traditional participants are motivated to participate in investigations and in research when there's existing relationships with the individual, like myself, or an organization, like the community-based organization I mentioned, or the coalition that Roy C. Chavez used to lead, or you're addressing a perceived risk. So something that they perceive, right, that's the design and the effort is clearly connected to research identified by community members and community issues. The other thing to highlight is these individuals are less likely to be motivated for the sake of learning and contributing to science. They are, so this, do not assume that someone's going to be motivated to purely contribute to science for the creation of new knowledge. Though they are excited and see their contribution throughout the project, they're initially motivated due to the existing relationship and the fact that you're addressing a research issue they identified. If we move along to data collection and methodologies, designing data collection and collection, actual samples and recording, I have done a variety of different things here. We've looked at food products, homegrown food products grown at the groceries or purchased at local grocery stores. We've done irrigation water, harvested rainwater, drinking water. We've looked at soils and gardens, play areas, yards, unamended soils. We've also are looking at dust of what is the settled particles in and around the area in which someone lives. And so here's just a few images, right, is where participants, so if we go back to this graphic, participants are deciding what vegetables to submit based on what's culturally relevant and what they consume regularly. They're deciding which water source based on the exposure pathway they're most interested in. They're deciding where to collect the soil based on where their kids play or maybe a proposed garden. And they're setting up an air monitor, or excuse me, a dust monitor, and collecting dust samples from an area where their children and or they heavily engaged. And so again, like when we talk about the co-design, this is where they are designing it on their property, and then together we're making sense of it. So we get some beautiful samples in the lab. These are some dried soils and food samples that we received over time. And there's a lot to be said about that 4 and 5, but I'm just kind of giving you snapshots and going through them briefly so we have time for questions. The next set is analyzing samples and data together. And so with Project Harvest, we designed this where I was very much interested in understanding, is self-efficacy and understanding of data and data, you know, these knowledge and awareness as well as efficacy and action, are they associated with the way in which you measure the environment, way in which you do some environmental monitoring? And so in Project Harvest, you were given, you were randomly selected to have a laboratory kit or a do-it-yourself kit. Here you can see for the do-it-yourself, you would, these first images are showing, sulfur-reducing bacteria, which would be an indicator of total coliform. And then here in the center, and this other color chart is looking at inorganic arsenic in water samples. And so this is where community members either got that lab or DIY or DIT, right, do it together kit, and they would switch every year. And then at the end, last year, they just decided what kit they wanted, or they did both. But something really exciting about the do-it-yourself was that there was much more reported, I shouldn't say much more, but there was reported intergenerational learning and group learning as a result of the which I should call do-it-together methodologies versus the lab. So that was a cool finding. There's a lot of findings. There's a lot of findings. With Gardenroots, and also with Project Harvest, but mainly with Gardenroots, people are thinking about these exposure pathways. And so here what you see is is an exposure assessment, you know, visualization of that calculation. And so here we're working with the community members to improve this exposure calculation, to improve our understanding of these milligrams of contaminant per kilogram of body weight per day, to use in exposure and risk modeling. And so you can see here that we would administer surveys, we do some in vitro bioaccessibility assays, which I can briefly describe in a second, and dietary assessments. And so what you can see here in this visual abstract, when we looked at the exposures of preschool children to arsenic, cadmium, and lead, we looked at these multiple exposure pathways, but we also exposed these environmental media to a synthetic gut solution to see how much would be absorbed once it's in the system, and a synthetic lung solution if you were to inhale these particles. If we look specifically, this is just very generic for one community, right? Running, this is like, I think over 100,000 simulations, right, for one community to look at exposure pathways. And we can see that these pathways differ by metal and by the environmental media. And so this level of high engagement and co-creation is critical because it's not always going to be the same. You can see arsenic was dominated by water, cadmium's dominated by those food products, as well as some dust. And then you see lead dominated by the plants and soil. And then in addition, if you just take the plants themselves, you'll notice that the uptake patterns are different by contaminant and plant type. And so again, this level of co-creation allows you to get these diversity of food products. And then together you can understand what the exposure is, and then if there is an associated risk. Now the fun part is thinking about interpreting data, right? So now it's like, okay, we did all this, you know, you got trained, you put the research question forth, right? Like, this is what we're worried about in our community based on our experiences. You're experts in your own right. We come together, we design the methodology, you take it, you learn how to use a kit, you collect those samples, you submit those samples, or you run the analysis at home and submit the results to us. And now we have all of this data. And so what do we do next? Well, the biggest thing is you data share, right? I mean, so this is where very exciting thinking about having an art degree is like, how do you share information in non-traditional ways? And so when we think about what components to have in your data sharing to and with participants, we know that participants want this, like, what did you find? What did you look for and how much? We know that they're looking for some type of analysis or form of comparison and recommendation. So it's critical to always be providing an immediate intervention and prevention act packaged with the data, so that we're, coming together and understanding it and immediately able to take it and translate the research into action. I would also highlight that these data sharing activities should be informed by, those who are going to use the data set. And so here's some pictures of some formative evaluation efforts for Project Harvest. This is where we probably did, oh my God, to get to our final visualization solution, we did like 19 different versions, which, that's kind of, so I'm just highlighting this iterative back and forth in co-design, which actually can be called this equity-centered community design practice. With Gardenroots, community members were like, the first time I did Gardenroots, like in 2010, it was like, I just want to know like how much, like, can I eat the food and how much? And it's like, okay, let me do my best here. So you can imagine, like, with this conservative risk assessment process, I was like, this is how much you can eat from your garden. So if you're super risk friendly, you can have 70 cups of onion, from your garden. That's like a tremendous amount of salsa or whatever you'd be making in that space. But the idea is that these are like throwbacks. This is another visualization where we're thinking about like, okay, we want to show everybody's data aggregated with these standards as well as their data point, and if there's an exceedance. So this was just another style of report back. This was a table that you would, where we took all the like plants that were submitted for the whole community and then reported, right, these, like how much you could eat from your garden at these different arsenic concentrations. With the community, with the preschoolers, parents really, we needed to see the age groups. We needed to show the percent of contribution by the different environmental media. And so here was very, we designed it so that a parent could quickly see, like, if I'm going to reduce my child's exposure to arsenic, I'll be reducing their amount of kale and lettuce. I was impressed that they even got their kids to eat kale, right? That's outstanding. For cadmium, right, looking at the carrot, and for lead, truly addressing that garden soil, right? And so this was like this, these are important visualizations to be generating. In the long run with both Project Harvest and Gardenroots, this is like a tutorial on like how to interpret your data. So you would get this, you'd get a figure that has your sample highlighted in color, everyone else in the community highlighted in gray. If you collected a yard and a garden, you would have those side by side. Or if you collected a water sample and a field blank, you'd have those side by side. You'd be able to see our limit of detection. So this is explaining the instrument we use, as well as all these standards that are associated with the legend also provided. And I can show you an interactive form of this on the website. As bringing the arts back into this. So I have an art degree, very excited to think about and to test, do people learn? Does their sense of efficacy, emotional response, and action, does it change based on the way the data is communicated? And so this is where I had a Master's of Fine Arts student, Dorsey Kaufman, in the lab. And this is where we designed Ripple Effect per Project Harvest. This is where you had the data set, it got converted into sound waves, and you had a speaker and a tray of water and a sensor. And so the more vibration, the higher the concentration. And if that light went off, that means you exceeded a standard. So this was very cool to think about and pretty a form of environmental art. However, it kind of backfired a little bit, right? Because if you saw a lot of action and the light go off, that was actually being that it was a bad, like no, I shouldn't say bad, but it was an elevated value. So you would be like, whoa, oh, that's not good. And so that was an interesting thing to tease out, right? But when we evaluated this, and you can see that we have submitted some paper, one of them got published already in the Association for Computing Machinery, but we also are looking to publish an environmental behavior and more environmental communication journal, is that we noticed that though people learned with both like that booklet and the visualizations I previously showed, as well as the art, the art had to be supported by the booklet and the visualization. So that was one big finding. But the other thing, as we noticed, is that people who, when we compared recall, people were able to more specifically recall their data from the art experience. So they had a higher sense of recall and a higher emotional response versus if they just had the booklet itself. And so that was a whole nother fun design of randomly selecting people to go to art, booklet and art, data sharing experiences. And like I said, and like we published just some of the stuff, so I can pass it around if you're interested. As I stated, always super important to present strategies and to reduce exposures. This is just one example of practices that people can take right away if they were concerned with the dust or soil concentrations in and around their home. And what we, we're getting to like this part of like, when we have all this data, so you've reported it back, you've done your co-design, you've done your co-creation in the science, your co-design with the data sharing. And now you get to this place of like, what can I and we do? And so we've known, we've seen changes in individual action, right? So I have that documented. I can see people modifying behavior to reduce exposure. When I first started Gardenroots, someone was like, oh, great, Monica. Now people are going to stop eating vegetables because of the type of work you're doing. And I was like, what? Okay, let me just show you that I have faith in the families that I'm working with and alongside to interpret the data and the nuances associated with the data set. And sure enough, right, community members were like, yeah, I'm still going to eat, right? That when, the majority of them was like over a set 80%, I can't remember the exact number, but I have it in a paper I published, would continue to eat fruits and vegetables from, from their garden, but they'd modify their practice, right? Modify their gardening practice to reduce their exposure, do wet mopping, as you can see some of the things highlighted here. And so one of the frameworks that I use to understand changes is the environmental health literacy framework. And so you can see here, I'm going to go through these concentric circles. So the first inner circle is this literacy around awareness and knowledge. And so this is a quote that I think is really exciting to read from a participant. So being able to participate in something that's at my home and I can see what happens there and then get these types of laboratory results that show exactly what's going on is really valuable. And if I had any perceptions that differ than what is in this booklet, I have to reconsider and say, these are the facts. Another exciting finding, unfortunately, when thinking about the knowledge and awareness and scientific literacy, data literacy, is we had to cancel one of a large sampling campaign due to the pandemic. And so because we had done that cancellation of the sampling because of the high level of engagement, obviously be protective of human health in that space, we decided to administer a survey. And we're like, oh, I wonder if people are more reliant on their gardens now, more reliant on their harvested rainwater. And one of the promotoras, right, the community health workers who had been engaging these families for almost 3 years now, or over 3 years, was like, Monica, you've been giving them these booklets. They have these booklets and all this data at the end of every year. Like, maybe you should ask them if they're able to interpret data better. And I was like, Lisa, you're the best. I was like, yes, let's do that. So we wrote a question to say, now that you've been in part of Project Harvest, are you able to better interpret pandemic data? And over 60% of, is it 60? Gosh, I need to brush up on my specific numbers here. And this is all being recorded, but the majority of people stated that they agreed or strongly agreed that as a result of Project Harvest, they were better able to interpret pandemic data and the visualizations presented during the pandemic. I mean, that was really special to hear that. When we think about skills and self-efficacy, right? Self-efficacy is that like confidence that you might have in yourself to create change, the confidence or that you believe you have some control, right, over your environment, to take more productive, enable health protective decisions. And so we're still teasing out, right? So for Project Harvest, we've bracketed the whole project and we're working through this, a lot of data, but some preliminary information, data that we have that we published already is that we didn't see an association between a participant's self-efficacy and race, income, and education. And so this, it's kind of like, I'm highlighting this here today to be like, well, yeah, we shouldn't see a difference, but I want to acknowledge here that although socioeconomic factors affect countless other life outcomes, they don't predict the success of a community scientist, right? And I think that's really important to understand here, is that when you do things right and you are co-created and you're, co-designing, you'll have a lot of different outcomes and you'll have some great things happen. I'm not going to start critiquing a bunch of other projects. So the other thing is this level of data interpretation and action. So these are just some images. You can see this is like a interactive snapshot from the website. And no need to kind of like read through this table entirely, but this is just showing that like these were different uses for the rainwater. This was the interpretation. And was it correct? And it's like people are interpreting the data properly and taking the necessary steps to protect themselves and their family and livestock. And when you take it to this like larger level of like, what can we all do now? And we think about it more from the community collective space. So if we're thinking about this community change space, this is where, again, we're wrapping up some data from Project Harvest, but when I can reflect on Gardenroots and Project Harvest already. And so when we think about this outer circle, what I want to highlight is structural change and these little p, what Cambi et al. Called little policy examples. And so they might not be this like federal level change and overturn, but they're local and regional or just like school district based. And so let's go through some of those. So in Gardenroots in one community, participants, we revealed that the water utility was serving water exceeding the drinking water standard for arsenic. This is where community members, right, when we were in the data sharing event, they immediately like separated out those who were on the public water supply got in one corner, private well water in another corner. And the public water supply people were like, we need to tell others. And so we both reported to the state. State went back and tested. And yes, in fact, this utility was serving water that exceeded the drinking water standard for arsenic. And they got a notice of violation and fine and were forced to get into compliance. If we look at this community, this is Superior, Arizona. I have a very kind of high detailed timeline and map here that was developed by one of my former students, but just highlighting like the historical context, right? And the challenges in mining communities. And so in this space, we looked at, you can see the average concentration of arsenic, right? The background in Arizona is around 10. And we can see here that not only were we visualizing it in a way that would help families, but community members wanted to see past study data. And so we've merged these past data sets with our current data sets. We've generated visualizations to help inform families moving into the area. And we reported, did a variety of data sharing meetings as well as planning meetings with the coalition in the area. We also worked together with the Arizona Department of Health Services, PANEL, and ATSDR to host a soil shop for this community. And we were able to analyze, a good number of samples and inform community members of do a soil screening for them. In this area, this is the Hayden Winkleman, where this is considered an alternative Superfund site. So the mining company is aware of what they've done and they're paying for cleanup while they continue to operate. This is in time where you had a high wind event in the area. And so community members, the promotora was sending me, basically the promotora was receiving a bunch of images from the community. And then the promotora was like, Monica, I'm getting all these images. What should we do? They sent them all to me. I consolidated them into a report. And then I run a multi-organizational call with all of the agencies, local, state, and federal agencies working to do cleanup in the site, and sent it to all of them to say like, what's going on here? And now in these meetings, we have EPA's enforcement office attending and actually requesting from the state a list of all of the public complaints in this area to actually do something. Granted, this stuff takes a long time. And so it's like you get them this information and they yet to have still. So this was like 6 months ago. EPA has all the images. The state has all the images, all the complaints, but neither agency has actually put together a public announcement, anything to address this. And then the mine hasn't even done a public announcement about it. And so it's a little frustrating, but I would say this is still a little p because we have platforms to engage and communicate, and that community members are collecting data and sending it to champions in their space so that it can be properly archived. I do want to highlight, this is a great example, former student, well, current student still, they got their master's, staying on for their PhD, but this is where in that same community, a worker strike impacted the arsenic and lead concentrations in the rooftop harvested rainwater. And so this is where we saw that as a result of a worker strike to improve the human conditions and work environment, we saw a decrease in the average winter arsenic concentrations and a decrease in the range of lead concentrations in rainwater, right? So we saw that the smelter, that this worker strike, which then led to the shutdown of the smelter, improved environmental health and quality in the area. So not only were they working for a justice issue in an occupational setting, but that effort for justice in that occupational setting translated into improved environmental health for the town. And what I'm going to end with is a very important literature review that former student Leona Davis is first author on this paper, where we asked the question, right, I've gone through all this. I highlighted like a 10 years worth of work to the best of my ability. And so after doing this and having, the student in my lab was like, well, what are these design elements that could actually create this change? So we're using this theoretical framework of environmental health literacy, and we see that outer circle for community change and action, but maybe we can look to the literature, right, to see what has been done. And so this is where we used a critical interpretive synthesis. We scanned over 500 articles, narrowed it down to around 200, and then from there, identified the ones that had achieved some type of structural change. Again, going back to that definition of affecting a meso-level environmental enforcement policy or some sort. And one of the biggest, the major three themes, we coded all of this, ran some statistics, and where we saw the most significance, right, when we saw the study design elements that were most significant across the 26. So I forgot to say, we scanned all these articles, got it down to around 200, and then only 26 had achieved some type of structural change. And of those 26, what we saw, the design elements, when we coded them, really falls under community members as leaders, opening a policy window, and long-term commitment. So let's go into these a little bit more. So one of the big things is 100% of those 26 studies described that had structural change outcomes started with local knowledge informing the research question. So that's number one. We also saw a moderate correlation was observed between structural outcomes and partnerships lasting more than 4 years. So highlighting that these partnership building and trust are critical in structural change efforts to benefit environmental justice communities. We saw that the community directed, right, played a significant role in structural change, and having formal participant structure and understanding was important. The other thing to highlight was this opening the policy window and engaging decision makers throughout the project. And so I'm going to get back to that, but one of the ways you engage is you think about your research translation and data sharing. And so in the case studies that resulted in structural change, 81% collected data from more than one source. So they were thinking about multiple types of information and data. They had 50% collected both quantitative and qualitative. So you'd have like an air quality measurement as well as a personal story or oral history. And 50% engaged in data translation for decision makers, meaning that they were specifically designing their data sharing for decision makers to be able to use the information. And then highlighting that when you do this type of participatory research, we saw across projects is that they tend to value multiple knowledges, including indigenous and non-Western forms of knowledge, which sometimes can be absent from modern decision-making spaces. Of the 26, 19 case studies successfully achieved a policy win, and these policy-related activities were included in project planning. And so that was a big take home to think about, is that when you're designing this, not only do we know how critical it is to make sure your question is good and that it's informed by those, right, that you're engaging in the communities you aim to serve, but it's also thinking about like the policy related outcome and goal, right? So you're engaging some decision makers and others, right? And this is truly the transdisciplinary approach, right? Because you're trying to solve an issue that irregardless of disciplinary boundary and irregardless of stakeholder boundary, right? We end the paper with some summary statements. And one of them is we want to acknowledge that a lot of papers, and we know that this is important, is that we know that being part of participatory research is you can get this increase in understanding of risk and self-efficacy. However, we do know that the benefits of understanding or self-efficacy might not be enough, right? It might not outweigh that environmental justice community members' limited time and energy to invest or provide a clear path of action. And so this is just important when you're thinking about these, like participation in itself as a benefit, that we really want you to think bigger and beyond that. And then the recommendations for the future are to think about how to leverage your power and privilege, set structural change as a goal from the inception of the work, and consider your positionality. So when we look at structural change, we highlight, evaluate the root causes that are creating, right? Evaluate the root cause of the identified health risk. Analyze the power and policy structures that cause that risk. Identify a structural change goal and do community-driven evaluation to assess whether your project is benefiting the community. And then we talk about consider the positionality, right? And this is where I talked about, myself and others being cultural knowledge brokers. So you have this understanding of both the community experience and the science to enhance the rigor and relevance of participatory research. This picture has a lot of people in it, but probably not everybody. As the project grows and we have more and more engagement, and we started to try to do a network analysis. Woo! It's just awesome, right? Awesome to do this it's an honor to do this kind of work. But big shout out to the promotoras, community partners, researchers, and students in the project. And yeah, thank you to all of you for listening. And again, just a big shout out to community researchers and students who have been part of this.
Well, Monica, thank you so much. This has been just an amazing just so many questions and things that I have been so inspired by that I could probably kidnap you and talk with you for the next all night long. But I would love to open it up for questions for Dr. Ramirez. So I have asked people to put questions in the chat. And also if people want to just unmute and ask a question, that's okay too. I'm on a small laptop, so I have a difficult time seeing raised hands, but Emily can also maybe help me that if somebody does have their hand raised, she can help me try to identify someone. But please feel free if you just want to shout a question out or put it in the chat, we will get to it. So questions from the audience. Reb, I do see your physical hand.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ramirez. This is amazing work with participatory action research. This is amazing. Thank you. Thank you. I am wondering how a citizen research project can be started in an area. Like, what was it was your impetus, I would imagine, that got this going. And what are the usual ways of these kinds of projects being birthed into our communities?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I was trying to highlight that in the beginning of, really meeting people where they are. And so when I think about the origin story of Gardenroots, it really stemmed from being in serving as a research translation coordinator for a large Superfund research, like a large grant, and realizing like, okay, my job is to be this liaison. Well, okay, like I'm going to go meet people. And so I reached out to state and federal agencies and learned about a site that was about to get listed. And so I went to their community meetings and I went to their town council meetings, and I just took notes. I sat in the back and wrote a lot of notes down. And what I was writing down was all their questions. And I actually eventually published on how their questions evolve over time, how they went from more like fate and transport to then exposure and then understanding like health outcomes, which was really cool to think about that like knowledge and evolution change. But that's, I would say, like meeting people where they are and listening. And then afterwards I was like, hey, you have some really cool questions. I don't have site specific data, but would you want to work together on it? And they're like, sure, And I was like, I don't have money right now, but I'm interested, you know, I would like to this is, you know, you have really good question. I want to I think this is could be a good project. Years later, I was able to get, you know, grants for it and then start that. You know, Project Harvest was like, you know, again, community members still, people who I engaged through Gardenroots. So we had there's a big community garden in Tucson, and others who were like, hey, we're collecting all this harvested rainwater. Can we use it on the food, on crops we're going to eat? I was like, that's a great question. I don't know. And then there were researchers at the University of Arizona, right, who were really interested in that as well. And so that was like, I became this, like, brought everyone together to design and lay that project out. And so I guess like what ends up happening is you meet people where they are, you listen, you're honest, you're transparent, you use the co-created approach, right, of saying like, what do you think? How should we do this? Recognize that it's iterative. It'll take longer. It'll be a little bit harder. But it's just like the way that I like to, it just seems to be, it's like the right way to do science, like for me, right? That's how it feels. It just, so I guess, and so then over time, like you get invited in, you know, someone's like, oh, you know, like the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality gave my name to somebody who's like, hey, we need to start looking at this. I write, you know, time sensitive grant, we get it. Now we're looking at the impacts of wildfires on soil and dust quality in mining communities. You know, it's like, so that's just one recent example.
Great. How about some other questions? I'm looking around, trying to see who might have a hand up. Well, I have one that I will put out there. So I just loved hearing about the environmental literacy framework that you use. And I know that we're trying to do sort of a version of that in several of the projects that are going on here. What I would love to hear about is a little bit on the evaluation side, how you were able to capture that change from the I to the we, from the individual self-efficacy to the collective action. And that just seems like such a profound shift. And how did you sort of design, whether it was surveys or your qualitative or quantitative process, to tap into that?
You hide some slides, right, because you just don't have enough time, but
yeah,
you know, this one is looking at, so just, you know, acknowledging that it's a mixed methods approach, and having a large, like working with the College of Education on, and having an external evaluator, and writing, right, having written survey instruments, semi-structured interviews. We did focus groups, and then participant observations, as well as analysis of journal entries and emails. And so this is a lot of data. I mean, this doesn't even include like a set of chalk talks. This is, so like when, so one of the biggest things we ended up doing is, right now I have a student, since Project Harvest wrapped up, we're comparing the, you know, the pre-survey to the post, which is just like majority are quantitative, and then there's open-ended questions that we're seeing. And the cool thing is already we're seeing a big change is then when people talk about is harvested rainwater safe? In the beginning, people were like, yeah, it's safe for plants I'm not going to eat, or something to that effect. This is preliminary data, so no quoting me on it. But now in the post, they're saying it depends on your use, right? So they're very much seeing like there are standards for different types of use. If you're going to fill a swimming pool, if you're going to use it for livestock and poultry. So that's one example. But the qualitative data from the interviews and the focus groups went through rigorous coding, right? So we get it all transcribed. If it's in Spanish, we got it translated to English and then transcribed. We uploaded into In Vivo, and then from there just built out a code book, and then had others code to look for interreliability among the team, and then ran through it. And it's through that is where we're started to see these like really beautiful like changes and get these quotes that are unreal. I mean, in some cases.
Yeah, that was so amazing to see. Thank you for sharing that. Other questions?
Someone wrote like, how do we access this research? And so that's always annoying, right? About the like, unless you're at a university, you might not have the subscriptions to these journals. So I would say, whoever, if Emily or somebody else wants me to just send out a set of PDFs, I'm happy to do that for your group.
We would love that. And in fact, I noticed, I was so excited about your talk that I did already look up a few of the papers, and it looked like you do a great job of sometimes sharing even parts of your survey instruments when I guess that's shareable from your perspective. And I wondered, if there are any other instruments that you've published that perhaps our group might be able to think about replicating or working with you to, possibly even build or replicate a survey that you've done, because I think a lot of that would be so beneficial for where we're at right now with some of our projects.
Yeah, no problem. I think the two Davis papers have the Davis 2020 will have like the interview script, the focus group script, and I believe the survey, at least one version of the survey. Gardenroots has like there's in the Sandhouse et al. There should be a set of the questionnaire that was given, and yeah, I think whatever you need, just like if there's something specific, just let us know.
Thank you. That's so kind of you. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Who else has questions? We've got just a few more minutes and I'd love to open it up. I know we've got a couple of students on the line here and would love to hear from anyone who's going into possibly a career in health or environmental studies about what you might have learned today and what more you might want to know. Anyone want to be brave?
If no one else has a question, I have one that you've touched upon a bit throughout your presentation, but I always like to hear different perspectives on this, on kind of the main obstacles that you encounter, whether those be political or with community engagement or anything like that. In New Hampshire, there's obviously going to be very different obstacles than in Arizona, but I think kind of our collective strategies of overcoming those might be helpful. So if you have any insights there, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think, so I mean, one thing is the people getting nervous of like, I want to do this project, but I don't want to be identified in the project. Mm-hmm. That happens I would say frequently enough to highlight. And so this is where the way you handle privacy is critical. There's also some of the contaminants that we measure could put somebody in a position that makes them liable to disclose if they were trying to sell their home, or if they had elder members of the sensitive population visit their household, they would have to disclose. So basically when there's a pollutant that has a legal precedent, right? And so I have made my own consent form regarding that to make sure they knew that if they were part of this project, they would be getting data on these pollutants that they might put them in a position of liability. Barriers, like I think with thinking about the team that you bring together, one thing it can be, you got to think about who you bring in, and are they culturally humble, and I think about some of and this is being recorded and I don't know when you're going to cut it off, right? But there was interesting challenges, differences of opinion, but it like showed some true colors, and essentially of like, wow, I don't know if I'd ever work with that person again. That's really hard. And actually I think the interpersonal dynamics like that is probably the hardest thing for me to handle and navigate through. I still get like young lady, or hey, like Monica, like there's your boss, like someone I'm employing in the project, like I'm the director, I'm the principal investigator, and they're like, hey, ahí está tu jefe, there's your boss over there. And I was like, what are you talking about? I'm their boss, dude. So there's still like unconscious bias that I hit up, that I kind of, and that can be annoying. So I just keep reminding people like what I do, who I am. Mm-hmm. Obstacles like in doing the commute, I would say like, yeah, I mean, those are some of the things on the top of my head that I would highlight. And then just like learn, like one of the things that can be really hard to know all of the nuances And so it's like, oh, like you have like, even though the towns are 5 miles apart, the government, the way the government, they run it is so different, you know? And I think that you just like observing, right? It's like, I would say like, just acknowledging like how different each space can be and what it, and rule, right? Rule is a health, like determinant of health in itself. And so that has to be acknowledged as well. And so I think that acknowledging, I guess these aren't, you know, going beyond what you said of it, like an obstacle, but I think it's not an obstacle per se. It's just a challenge of a very delightful challenge, I would say, you know, to learn how to engage across like these different areas.
Well, you've shared so much with us, and we're deeply grateful for all the time you've spent, and loved seeing all the art too, and the ways in which communication can be reimagined. So thank you so much. There is just a wealth of beautiful things you've shared with us today, and we're, again, just so appreciative. Before we close out tonight, I'll just invite everyone else to join me in thanking Dr. Ramirez for an amazing talk and for all the work that you do. Thank you so much. Yay.